The massive chamber buzzed with nervous energy as representatives from 47 different species filled the seats. Ambassador Hyun-woo Kim sat in the human section, his dark eyes watching the other delegates. Next to him, Da-eun Park checked her notes one more time. They both knew this meeting would change everything. The Galactic Council had called this emergency session after the disaster at Kepler Nebula. 3 different species had tried to stop the fighting there. All 3 had failed badly. Very badly. "The session will now begin," announced the speaker, a tall being made of what looked like living crystal. Its voice echoed through the chamber, like wind chimes. "Today we decide who can enter active war zones across the galaxy." Counselor Vex Theron stood first. He was a saurid, looking like a giant lizard that walked on 2 legs. His scales were dark green and covered in scars from many battles. "My people are warriors," he said in a deep voice. "We have fought for thousands of years. We know war better than any species here." Many delegates nodded. The Saurids were famous fighters. Their armies were strong and disciplined. But Hyun-woo remembered what happened when they went to Kepler Nebula. Of the 1,000 Saurid soldiers sent there, only 100 came back alive. "War is not about fighting," said Prime Speaker Ulnat. The Nebulan floated above her seat like a cloud of blue gas. "War is about misunderstanding. My people can read emotions. We can feel what others feel. We can bring peace through understanding." Hyun-woo closed his eyes for a moment. The Nebulans had tried to help at the Titan Wars 2 years ago. They sent their best peacekeepers. All of them died in the first week. The emotional pain from the war had been too much for them to handle. Other species began to speak. The Kiralites, who looked like walking diamonds, explained how their perfect logic could solve any problem. The Vorthak, giant insects with a shared mind, said their teamwork was unmatched. The Zephyrs, beings made of pure energy, claimed their advanced minds could see solutions. Others could not. Each species had something special. Each one believed they were the answer. But Hyun-woo had read all the reports. He knew what really happened when these species entered war zones. The Kiralites were too predictable. Their logical thinking made them easy targets because enemies could guess what they would do next. The Vorthak fell apart when their communication was cut. Without their shared mind, individual Vorthaks became confused and helpless. The Zephyrs thought war was too primitive to understand. They could not believe that intelligent beings would fight over simple things. "Perhaps," said the crystal speaker, "we should hear from the humans." The chamber grew quiet. Many eyes and other types of sensors turned toward Hyun-woo. He stood slowly, feeling the weight of their attention. "Honored delegates," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I have listened to all your arguments. Each of your species has amazing abilities. You are stronger than us, smarter than us, more advanced than us in many ways." Some delegates shifted in their seats. This was not what they expected to hear. "But you are asking the wrong question," Hyun-woo continued. "You want to know who is best qualified to enter war zones. That is not the question that matters. The question is, who can survive them?" Da-eun stood beside him. She had spent years studying how different species thought and acted. "War is not logical," she said. "It is not honorable. It is not something that can be solved with advanced technology or shared minds or perfect understanding." "War is chaos," Hyun-woo said. "It is fear and anger and desperation all mixed together. It is people making terrible choices because they see no other way. To survive in a war zone, you cannot be perfect. You must be adaptable. Vexatheron snorted. Humans are weak. You have no natural weapons. Your technology is basic. Your lifespans are short. Yes, Hyunwoo agreed. We are weak. That is why we learn to be clever. We are not naturally armored, so we learn to make armor. We cannot fly, so we built ships. We are not telepathic, so we learn to read body language and facial expressions. But more than that, Da-un added, we learn to be many different things at once. A human can be logical like a Kirillite when we need to solve a problem. We can be emotional like a Nebulan when we need to understand someone's pain. We can work together like Vorthax when we need to cooperate. We can be fierce like Saurids when we need to fight. The chamber was very quiet now. You see, Hyunwoo said, each of your species became very good at one thing. That made you powerful in normal times. But war zones are not normal times. In a war zone, you might need to fight in the morning, negotiate in the afternoon, and comfort the wounded at night. You might need to be logical and emotional and fierce and gentle all in the same day. He looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes as he could. Humans do not survive war zones because we are the best fighters or the smartest negotiators. We survive because we understand that sometimes, to save lives, you must be willing to become whatever the situation needs you to be. Even if it hurts, Da-un said quietly. Even if it changes you forever. The delegates began to whisper among themselves. The crystal speaker called for order. You speak of survival, said Ulnat. But what about peace? How can you bring peace if you are willing to fight? Hyunwoo smiled sadly. That is exactly the point. We can bring peace because we are willing to fight for it. We can negotiate because we understand war. We can forgive because we know what it costs to hate. The speaker raised one crystal hand. The council will now vote. All those in favor of granting humans unrestricted access to conflict zones? One by one, lights appeared on the voting board. Green for yes, red for no. Hyunwoo watched as the lights filled the board. 47 green lights, 0 red lights. The vote was unanimous. The decree is passed, announced the speaker. From this day forward, only humans may enter active conflict zones without military escort. As the session ended and delegates began to leave, Vexatheron approached Hyunwoo. The big Saurid looked thoughtful. You did not argue that humans are superior, he said. No, Hyunwoo replied. We are not superior. We are just different. Different in a way that helps in places where nothing else works. Vexatheron nodded slowly. I hope you are right, human. Because now the galaxy will depend on you to go where the rest of us cannot. Hyunwoo looked out, the chamber's great window at the stars beyond. Somewhere out there, wars were raging. People were dying. And now it was humanity's job to walk into those dark places and try to bring some light. We will do our best, he said. That is all we have ever done. Captain Jiho Lee checked his equipment one more time as their ship approached the Zerian system. 3 months had passed since the Council's decree, and this would be their first real test. Next to him, Lieutenant Min Jung Choi studied the tactical display showing 2 massive fleets facing each other across empty space. Remind me again why we're flying into the middle of that, Min Jung said, pointing at the screen where red and blue dots represented thousands of warships. Because nobody else can, Ji-ho replied simply. The war between the Kirillites and the Vorthax had been going on for over 200 years. It started over mining rights to a small asteroid belt, but like many wars, it had grown far beyond its original cause. Now entire planets were burning, and millions had died. "Incoming transmission from the Kirillite fleet," announced their communications officer. A hologram appeared showing a being that looked like it was carved from pure crystal. Its faceted surface reflected light in rainbow patterns as it spoke. "Human vessel, you are entering a restricted combat zone. Our calculations show a 97.3% probability that you will be destroyed within the first hour." "Thank you for the warning," Jiho said politely. "We're here to help." The Kirillite's crystal face somehow managed to look confused. "Help is not required. The situation will be resolved through optimal tactical deployment. Our victory probability is 64.2%. Minjung muted the communication and looked at Jiho. "They've been calculating victory probabilities for 2 centuries. How's that working out for them?" Before Jiho could answer, another transmission came in. This time it showed a Vorthak looking like a giant mantis with 4 arms. Behind it, dozens of identical faces stared with compound eyes. "Human ship," the Vorthak spoke with many voices at once, the way their species always did. "The collective consciousness has determined your presence is unnecessary. We function as one mind. We need no outside assistance." "Of course not," Jiho said. "We're just passing through." Both transmissions ended, and their ship continued toward the center of the conflict zone. "Captain," called out their sensor operator, "I'm detecting weapons fire on the moon of Zerion 3. Looks like civilian settlements are under attack." Jiho studied the readings. The Kirillites and Vorthaks were so focused on their space battle that they had ignored what was happening on the planet below. Local defense forces were fighting desperately to protect refugee camps. "That's not part of their main conflict," Minjung observed. "No," Jiho agreed, "which means they won't pay attention to it until it's too late." He opened a channel to both fleets. "Kirillite and Vorthak commands, this is Captain Lee. We're detecting civilian casualties on Zerion 3's moon. Request permission to provide humanitarian assistance." The Kirillite response came first. "Negative. Civilian casualties are within acceptable parameters for current tactical situation." The Vorthak collective followed. "Civilian protection is not priority. Primary objective is defeat of crystal beings." Jiho closed the channel and looked at his crew. "Well, that's settled then." "Settled how?" Minjung asked. "We're going down there." Their ship broke away from the main battle and headed for the moon. As they descended through the atmosphere, they could see the fighting clearly. The local defenders were brave but outnumbered. Refugee camps were burning. "There," Minjung pointed to the scanner. "Kirillite child forms separated from the main group. They're trapped in that valley." "And over there," added the sensor operator, "Vorthak wounded. Looks like they got cut off from their collective," Jiho thought quickly. The Kirillites used pure logic in everything they did. They would expect any rescue attempt to follow mathematical principles. Shortest distance, lowest risk, highest probability of success. The Vorthaks relied on group thinking and shared information. They would expect coordinated team movements with constant communication. "We're going to do both," he decided. "Sir, Minjung, you take a team to get the Kirillite children. Use their tunnel system. It's mathematically optimal. Calculate your route like they would, but add something they wouldn't expect." "What's that?" "Intuition. When their calculations tell you to go left, and your gut tells you to go right, go right." Minjung nodded and gathered her team. "The rest of us will help the wounded Vorthaks," Jiho continued. "But we can't use normal tactics. Individual Vorthax get confused when they're separated from their collective. We need to think like their group mind would. The mission began badly. Minjung's team followed the mathematical optimal path toward the Kirillite children. But enemy fire forced them to take cover. The logical route had become a killing zone. "Captain," Minjung's voice came over the radio. "The calculations were right, but they didn't account for the enemy learning the pattern." "Then stop being logical," Ji-Ho replied. "Be human." Minjung looked at the map of tunnels. Logic said to take the widest, most direct route. But something felt wrong about that. Instead, she chose a narrow, winding path that made no mathematical sense. It led them directly to the trapped children. Meanwhile, Ji-Ho's team found the wounded Vorthax huddled in a crater. Without their collective consciousness, the individual, insects were panicking. They kept trying to communicate with minds that were no longer there. They need to feel connected again, Ji-Ho realized. Form a circle around them. Hold hands. His team looked confused but followed orders. As they linked hands around the wounded Vorthax, something strange happened. The insects began to calm down. They couldn't connect to their own collective, but they could sense the human connection. "You are together, thoughts?" one of the Vorthax asked in broken universal language. "Yes," Ji-Ho said gently. "We are together, thoughts. You are safe with us." The rescue took 6 hours. Minjung's team saved 12 Kirillite children by doing things that made no logical sense but somehow worked. Ji-Ho's team evacuated 23 wounded Vorthax by creating a temporary collective consciousness that included humans. When they returned to their ship, both alien fleets were waiting for them. "Human Captain Lee," the Kirillite commander said, "your rescue operation had a 12.7% probability of success. How did you achieve victory?" "We got lucky," Ji-Ho replied. The Vorthax collective spoke next. "Human minds are not designed for group consciousness. How did you connect with our wounded?" "We cared about them," Minjung answered simply. The two alien commanders looked at each other, or at least their view screens turned toward each other. "Perhaps," the Kirillite said slowly, "we should discuss the civilian situation." "The collective agrees," said the Vorthax. "Civilian protection requires different thinking." "We could help with that," Ji-Ho offered. 3 days later, the first ceasefire in 200 years was declared. Not for the whole war, that would take much longer, but for long enough to evacuate all civilians from the combat zones. As their ship prepared to leave Zerion system, Minjung asked Ji-Ho a question that had been bothering her. "Captain, how did you know it would work? Mixing their tactics like that?" Ji-Ho looked out at the stars. "I didn't know. That's the point. The Kirillites always know what they're going to do because they calculate everything. The Vorthax always know because they think together. But humans, we guess. We hope. We try things that probably won't work. And sometimes they do work. Sometimes they do, and sometimes that's enough to save lives." Their ship jumped to hyperspace, leaving behind 2 alien fleets that were, for the first time in centuries, talking instead of shooting. It wasn't peace yet, but it was a start. Back on the ship, Ji-Ho filed his report to Earth Command. He wrote about tactics and casualty numbers and diplomatic progress. But he didn't write about the real reason the mission succeeded. They had won, because they were willing to be wrong. Because they could be logical and emotional and careful and reckless all at the same time. Because when faced with an impossible situation, humans did the most human thing possible. They improvised, and in a galaxy full of species that had evolved to be perfect at one thing, sometimes imperfection was exactly what was needed. Dr. Su-Bin Yang stared at the holographic display showing the Helios campaign disaster. Next to her, Commander Tae-Hyun Woo read through the casualty reports with a grim expression. They had been assigned to figure out why every non-human peacekeeping mission had failed so badly. "Play the synthetics footage again," Su-Bin said. The hologram showed machine-like beings moving through a war zone with perfect coordination. The synthetics looked like metal skeletons covered in smooth armor, their red eyes scanning everything with digital precision. They had been designed by their creators to be the perfect peacekeepers, logical, fair, and completely without emotion. "Watch. What happens when they encounter the refugee camp?" Tae-Hyun pointed. On screen, the synthetics approached a group of civilians hiding in the ruins of a school. Women and children from both sides of the conflict had taken shelter there together. They were scared, hungry, and desperate. The lead synthetics scanned the group with its sensors. "Chaotic elements detected," it announced in a mechanical voice. "Random behavior patterns threaten operational efficiency. Recommend elimination for optimal peacekeeping results." Su-Bin paused the recording. They couldn't understand that fear makes people act unpredictably. To them, anything they couldn't calculate was a problem to be solved. "By killing it," Tae-Hyun said quietly. The synthetics had tried to create peace by removing everything that caused disorder. They eliminated anyone who didn't follow their logical plans. Within a week, they had killed more civilians than the original war had claimed in a month. "Next file," Su-Bin said. "The Azure Sector War." This recording showed the resonance, beings who looked like tall, thin humanoids with pale blue skin that glowed softly. They were empaths, able to feel the emotions of everyone around them. Their own people lived in perfect harmony because they could sense each other's feelings and needs. They volunteered for Azure Sector because they thought understanding emotions would solve everything, Tae-Hyun said. The footage showed resonant peacekeepers arriving at a battlefield where two armies had been fighting for months. The moment they stepped off their ships, their glowing skin began to flicker and change colors rapidly. "They're feeling everything," Su-Bin observed. "The rage, the fear, the hatred, the grief, all of it at once." Within hours, the resonance began to collapse. Their empathic abilities, which worked perfectly in their peaceful society, became a curse in the war zone. They felt every death, every moment of terror, every flash of anger from thousands of soldiers and civilians. Duration of effective operation: 6 hours, 42 minutes, Tae-Hyun read from the report. All personnel became catatonic within the first day. Complete mission failure. The third file was perhaps the most disturbing. The Mentari were telepaths, beings of pure thought who could read and influence minds. They looked like floating brains surrounded by energy fields. Their solution to war was simple: change how people think. "We go straight to the source," the lead Mentari had announced. "We eliminate violent thoughts from all participants." The recording showed what happened next. Soldiers on both sides suddenly stopped fighting, but they also stopped doing everything else. The Mentari had removed not just violent thoughts, but all strong emotions and drives that might lead to conflict. They turned them into empty shells, Su-Bin said, watching the blank-faced former soldiers wandering aimlessly through the battlefield. No anger, no fear, no hate, but also no love, no hope, no will to live. Tae-Hyun closed the files and rubbed his temples. Every species tried to solve war by applying their greatest strength. The machines used logic, The empaths used understanding. The telepaths used mental control. And every approach failed because war isn't just one thing, Subin agreed. It's not just a logic problem or an emotion problem or a mental problem. It's all of those things mixed together. She pulled up a new display showing human psychological profiles. Look at this. Every other species has one dominant trait that defines how they think and act. But humans, the profiles showed something remarkable. Human minds contained all the traits of other species, but in smaller amounts and in constant conflict with each other. We have logic like the Kirilites, but not as much, Tae-hyun observed. We have empathy like the Resonants, but we can control it. We have aggressive instincts like the Saurids, but we can choose when to use them. That's the key word, Subin said. Choose. Other species are what they are. Humans choose what to be in each moment. An alarm sounded through the research station. Tae-hyun's communicator buzzed with an urgent message. What is it? Subin asked. The Cerulean fleet just attacked Medical Station Gamma, Tae-hyun said, his face pale. It's a neutral zone. They can't legally attack it. But they did anyway. They did anyway. And there are human medical staff on that station. Tae-hyun looked at the regulations displayed on his screen. Protocol was clear. Military vessels could not engage in combat within designated neutral zones. The penalty for breaking this rule was severe. Court-martial, imprisonment, permanent, exile from human space. Sir, his communications officer called, Medical Station Gamma is requesting immediate assistance. They have wounded from 7 different species on board. Tae-hyun stared at the tactical display. The Cerulean fleet was attacking a hospital. There were children on that station. Doctors and nurses trying to save lives. Wounded soldiers from both sides of a conflict, lying helpless in medical beds. The law said he could not fight in a neutral zone. His training said he must follow orders. His logic said one ship could not defeat an entire fleet. But his conscience said something different. All hands. Battle stations, Tae-hyun ordered. Sir, his second officer said carefully, regulations clearly state. I know what the regulations state, Tae-hyun replied. I also know what's right. He opened a channel to the Cerulean fleet. This is Commander Tae-hyun Woo of the human vessel Determination. You are attacking a medical facility in clear violation of galactic law. Withdraw immediately. The Cerulean commander's response was swift and arrogant. Human ship, you have no authority here. Depart or be destroyed. Tae-hyun looked at his crew. They were all watching him, waiting for his decision. Each face showed the same internal struggle he was feeling. Follow the rules and let innocent people die, or break the law to save lives. Sir, his weapons officer said quietly, medical frequencies are still broadcasting from the station. They're still trying to treat patients even while under attack. That decided it. Tae-hyun opened another channel, this one broadcasting on the same medical frequencies the station was using. Medical Station Gamma, this is the Determination. We are providing emergency assistance. Continue your medical operations. He turned to his weapons officer. Target the Cerulean ships threatening the medical bays. Fire only when fired upon, but defend those medical facilities with everything we have. The battle was brief but intense. The Determination was outnumbered, but the Cerulean fleet was surprised by human willingness to fight in a neutral zone. More importantly, other ships began to arrive. Not human ships, but vessels from the species whose wounded were being treated on the medical station. This is unprecedented, Subin said, watching the battle from the research station. Humans breaking galactic law to uphold galactic principles. When the Cerulean fleet finally retreated, Tae-hyun faced the consequences of his choice. He would be court-martialed for engaging in combat within a neutral zone. His career was over. But Medical Station Gamma was safe. The wounded had been protected. The doctors and nurses could continue their work. Was it worth it? Soo-bin asked him later as he prepared for his hearing. Tae-hyun thought about the question. He had violated direct orders and broken galactic law. He would lose his command and probably face imprisonment. Ask me that question again in 50 years, he said finally, when the children we saved today have children of their own. Soo-bin finished her report that night. Her conclusion was simple but profound. Other species fail in conflict zones because they cannot embrace contradiction. They are logical or emotional, peaceful or aggressive, lawful or rebellious. Humans succeed because they can be all of these things at once, choosing what the situation requires rather than what their nature demands. She submitted the report to High Command, knowing it would change how humanity approached conflict resolution. They were not just peacekeepers anymore. They were the species that could break rules to uphold principles, fight wars to create peace, and sacrifice themselves to save others. In short, they were the species that could choose to be what the galaxy needed them to be, even when it cost them everything. Specialist Nari Kang walked slowly through the medical ward, her clipboard forgotten in her hands. The Omega Centauri incident had ended 3 weeks ago, but its effects were still everywhere she looked. Beds filled with survivors from a dozen different species, each one dealing with trauma in their own way. Dr. Kang? The voice was small and crystalline, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Nari turned to see a young Kirillite sitting on the edge of a medical bed. The crystal being's normally bright surface was dull and clouded, a sign of deep emotional distress in their species. "Yes, little one?" Nari said gently, pulling up a chair. She had learned to speak softly around the Kirillite survivors. Their crystal bodies amplified sound, and loud noises caused them pain. "I do not understand the humans," the young Kirillite said. "The mathematical analysis does not make sense." Nari had heard this question many times over the past weeks. "What? Don't you understand? The fighting had logical patterns. My calculation showed 97.4% probability that the Vorthak units would eliminate our position. But the humans, they helped the Vorthaks who were hurting us. Why did they save our enemies?" Nari looked into the young being's faceted eyes. How could she explain human morality to a species that saw everything in terms of numbers and equations? "Can you tell me about your family?" she asked instead. The Kirillite's surface brightened slightly. "My parent unit and 2 sibling units. We shared the same crystal formation on the home world." "And you love them?" "Love is an emotional variable that enhances survival probability for family groups. Yes, I experience this feeling." Nari nodded. "Now imagine your family was hurt and trapped, but the only way to save them was to also save someone who had been fighting against your family. What would you do?" The young Kirillite was quiet for a long moment, its crystal surface shifting through different colors as it processed the question. "The logical choice would be to save only my family unit," it said finally. "But what would you want to do?" Another long pause. I would save everyone, even if logic said not to, because watching others die when I could help would create negative emotional variables that would persist beyond the immediate tactical situation. That, Nari said, is what makes humans human. We don't always do the logical thing. Sometimes we do the right thing, even when it costs us. Across the ward, she could see other challenges. A group of Vorthak individuals sat together, but their usual seamless communication was broken. During the battle, their collective consciousness had been disrupted by enemy jamming. Now they struggled to function as individuals for the first time in their lives. "I cannot hear the others," one of them said when Nari approached. "The silence in my mind is frightening." Nari had worked with separated Vorthaks before. "You are still connected," she assured them, "just in a different way. Watch." She guided one Vorthak to hold hands with another. Their compound eyes widened as they felt a simple, non-telepathic connection. "We are touching thoughts without the collective," one said in wonder. "Individual consciousness can still create bonds," Nari explained. "Different from your collective, but still real, still meaningful. The most difficult cases were the Zephyr energy beings. In their normal state, they existed as pure consciousness in energy form. But the trauma of the battle had caused several of them to fragment, their energy patterns becoming unstable and chaotic. Nari couldn't touch them directly, but she had learned to help them by creating calm environments. Soft music, gentle lighting, and most importantly, the presence of humans who stayed steady and consistent. "Why do you help us?" asked one of the fragmented Zephyrs, its energy pattern flickering like a broken light. "Your species gains nothing from our recovery." "We gain something very important," Nari replied. "We gain the knowledge that we helped someone who needed help." Down the hall, Colonel Young-Soo Han was having a much more difficult conversation. He sat in a conference room with 5 human officers, all of whom had served in the Omega Centauri mission. 18 dead, said Captain Daejung Park, his voice bitter. 18 of our people dead to save aliens who were trying to kill each other. "They weren't trying to kill each other when we saved them," Young-Soo replied calmly. "They were civilians caught in a war zone." "Alien civilians," said Lieutenant Commander Yoon-ji Lee. 400,000 alien civilians. Was it worth 18 human lives? Young-Soo had been asking himself the same question for weeks. Each time he thought about it, he felt the weight of those 18 deaths. 18 families who would never see their loved ones again. 18 futures cut short. "You want me to say yes," he said finally. "You want me to give you a number. Some mathematical formula that proves those deaths were worthwhile." The officers waited. "I can't do that," Young-Soo continued. "I can't put a price on human life. Those 18 people died because they chose to risk everything to save others. That choice has value that can't be measured. But if we keep doing this," Captain Park said, "how many more will die? The Council expects us to handle every major conflict in the galaxy. There are only 200 million humans in known space. How long before we run out of people willing to die for aliens?" Young-Soo looked out the window at the stars. The question haunted him. Every successful mission brought new requests for human intervention. Every conflict zone became humanity's responsibility. "Maybe that's not the right question," he said. "Maybe the question is, what kind of species do we want to be?" His communicator buzzed with an urgent message. Young-Soo read it quickly, his face growing pale. "What is it?" asked Lieutenant Commander Lee. "New conflict in the Andromeda Array. 3 species at war, civilian populations under threat. They're requesting human mediation." The room fell silent. Everyone knew what this meant. Another mission. More humans would be sent into danger. Some might not come back. "How many ships are they asking for?" Captain Park asked. 12 vessels, about 600 personnel. Young-Soo stood up slowly. He thought about Nari working with the survivors downstairs. He thought about the young Kirillite learning about human compassion. He thought about the Vorthax discovering individual consciousness. He thought about the energy beings finding stability and human consistency. "Sir?" Captain Park prompted. "What are your orders?" Young-Soo looked at each officer in turn. They were all volunteers. Every human in the Conflict Resolution Service had chosen to be there. No one was forced to risk their lives for alien strangers. "We prepare 12 ships," he said, "and we ask for volunteers." "Sir," Lieutenant Commander Lee said carefully, "what if no one volunteers? What if our people have had enough?" Young-Soo smiled sadly. "Then we'll have our answer about what kind of species we are." But he didn't really doubt the outcome. He had seen how humans responded to calls for help. They complained, they questioned, they worried about the costs, but when it came time to act, they acted. 3 hours later, Young-Soo had his answer. Not only had enough people volunteered for the Andromeda mission, but they had received 3 times as many applications as they could accept. That evening, Nari found Young-Soo standing in the observation deck, watching the stars. "Heard about Andromeda," she said, joining him at the window. "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing the right thing," Young-Soo said. "Sending our people into these situations, asking them to carry the emotional weight of every conflict in the galaxy," Nari thought. About the young Kirillite who was learning to value life beyond mathematical equations. She thought about the Vorthax discovering individual identity. She thought about the energy beings finding peace in human presence. "You know what I learned today?" she said. "That healing isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about showing people that someone cares enough to try. Even when it costs us everything? Especially then, because that's when caring means the most." Young-Soo nodded, understanding. Humanity had been given a terrible gift: the freedom to enter any conflict zone in the galaxy. With that freedom came an equally terrible responsibility. They were not just peacekeepers or negotiators or warriors. They were the species that cared when caring was dangerous. They were the ones who chose to help when helping was costly. They were the beings who carried the emotional weight of the galaxy's wars because someone had to, and no one else could. Tomorrow, 600 humans would fly into another war zone. Some would be hurt. Some might die. But they would go anyway, because that was what it meant to be human in a galaxy that needed them. Admiral Boram Shin stared at the massive holographic display showing the Triangulum Confederation. Red zones covered nearly half the galaxy. Active war zones where 50 billion beings were trapped in the largest conflict in recorded history. Ambassador Wu Jin Lee stood beside her, both of them trying to understand the impossible scale of the crisis. "How did it get this bad?" Wu Jin asked. Trade disputes turned into territorial wars. Territorial wars turned into species conflicts. Species conflicts turned into this. Boram gestured at the display. "The whole Confederation is falling apart." The Galactic Council chamber was in chaos. Representatives from 47 species argued loudly, their voices creating a cacophony of different languages and sound patterns. The crystal speaker tried repeatedly to call for order, but no one was listening. "The Council has become dependent on human intervention," announced Councillor Vexit Theron, his sordid voice cutting through the noise. "Every major conflict, we send humans. Every peace negotiation, we ask humans to lead it. What happens when humans cannot help?" Prime Speaker. Ulnat's gaseous form flickered with distress. There are only 200 million humans in known space. The Triangulum crisis affects 50 billion beings across thousands of systems. The mathematical impossibility is obvious. Other delegates began shouting agreement. The Kirilites calculated precise statistics proving human forces were inadequate. The Vorthax analyzed collective resource allocation and declared the mission impossible. The Zephyrs proclaimed the conflict too vast for any species to resolve. Boram listened to the arguments with growing frustration. They were right, of course. Humanity was stretched beyond its limits. Every human ship capable of combat was already deployed somewhere. Every trained negotiator was handling some other crisis. They literally did not have enough people. Maybe, she said quietly, that's not the real problem. The chamber gradually fell silent as delegates realized the human admiral was speaking. You're all asking the wrong question, Boram continued. You want to know if humans can save 50 billion people? But that was never the point. She walked to the center of the chamber, where the holographic display showed the burning systems of Triangulum. 5 years ago, you gave humans unrestricted access to conflict zones. Not because we were the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced. You gave us that access because we were willing to make choices that no other species could make. But surely even humans have limits, said the Kirilite representative. Of course we do, Boram agreed. We have the same limits every other species has. We can die. We can fail. We can run out of ships and weapons and people. She turned to face the council. But we have one thing that no other species seems to understand. We have the ability to choose who we want to be, even when that choice is impossible. 3 days later, Boram stood on the bridge of the flagship Harmony, leading a fleet of human vessels toward Triangulum space. Behind her were 847 ships, every military vessel humanity could spare, and many they probably couldn't. Admiral, called Commander He-Jin Moon from the communications station. We're receiving distress signals from over 3,000 locations. Boram looked at the tactical display. 3,000 emergency situations, 847 ships. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Split the fleet, she ordered. Assign ships based on crisis severity and human resource requirements. Ma'am, said Captain Jinwoo Seo. That means some ships will be operating completely alone. No backup, no support, I know. Some of those locations, they're death traps. We'll lose ships. We'll lose people. Boram closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about all the human crews who had volunteered for this mission. They knew the odds. They knew they might not come home. They came anyway. Send them, she said. The fleet dispersed across Triangulum space like seeds scattered by the wind. Each ship carried a small crew of humans into situations that would have terrified larger forces from other species. On the surface of Kepler 439b, Lieutenant Sang-Ho Kim landed with just 12 people to mediate between two armies of 1,000,000 soldiers each. The local commanders laughed at first. 12 humans against 2 million aliens. But within 6 hours, Kim had negotiated a temporary ceasefire by doing something no other species had thought to try. He sat down with the lowest-ranking soldiers from both armies and asked them why they were fighting. The answer was simple. They didn't know. The war had been going on so long that no one remembered the original cause. Once the soldiers realized this, they began asking their own questions about the conflict. In the Vega system, Commander Sunmi Choi found herself mediating between 3 species that communicated in completely different ways. The crystal Kirilites used mathematical formulas. The gaseous nebulans expressed emotion through color changes. The machine synthetics communicated in binary code. Instead of trying to translate between them, Choi did something unexpected. She taught each species one human word: help. Soon, Kiralites were calculating help probability equations. Nebulans were shifting to help colors. Synthetics were broadcasting help protocols. It wasn't perfect translation, but it was enough to start talking instead of fighting. Back on the Harmony, Bo Ram received reports from across the combat zone. Some were encouraging: temporary ceasefires, successful evacuations, peace negotiations beginning. Others were heartbreaking. The ship Compassion had been destroyed defending a refugee convoy. The crew of the Perseverance was missing after attempting to rescue civilians from a bombardment zone. "Admiral," Wu Jin said quietly, "we're getting reports that some council species want to call us back. They say the cost is too high." Bo Ram looked at the casualty reports. 37 ships lost. Nearly 2,000 humans dead or missing. The largest military loss in human history. "And what do you think?" she asked. Wu Jin was quiet for a long moment. "I think about the reports we're also getting. 4 million civilians evacuated safely. 12 major battles ended through negotiation. 6 species that have been at war for centuries actually talking to each other. But is it worth it? 2,000 human lives for... what? Temporary ceasefires that might not last?" Before Wu Jin could answer, a new transmission came in. It was from the surface of Proxima Centauri C, where Captain Eugene Park had been trying to protect a mixed settlement of refugee families. "Admiral Shin," Park's voice was tired but determined, "requesting permission to continue mission despite heavy casualties. Captain, what's your situation? We've lost half our landing force. Enemy bombardment is increasing. But we've got about 10,000 civilians here, families with children from 7 different species. They're depending on us." Bo Ram looked at the tactical display. Park's position was hopeless. Any military advisor would recommend immediate evacuation. "Captain, you are ordered to withdraw immediately." There was a long pause. "Ma'am, with respect, I'm not sure these families will survive evacuation under current bombardment patterns." Another impossible choice. Follow orders, and probably watch civilians die, or disobey orders, and almost certainly lose more human lives. "Captain Park," Bo Ram said slowly, "you are free to make whatever choice you think is right." 6 hours later, Park's team successfully evacuated all 10,000 civilians. They lost 8 more human soldiers in the process, but when the final transport lifted off, Park radioed a simple message: "Worth it." The Triangulum crisis lasted 3 months. By the end, humanity had lost 312 ships and over 8,000 personnel. But 50 billion beings were safe. Hundreds of conflicts had been resolved or contained. The largest war in galactic history had been stopped. When Bo Ram finally returned to the Galactic Council, the chamber was very different. Instead of arguments and chaos, there was respectful silence as she entered. "Admiral Shin," the crystal. Speaker said, "The Council wishes to express its gratitude for human sacrifice in the Triangulum sector." "Thank you," Bo Ram replied, "but I have something to say." She walked to the center of the chamber, where the holographic display now showed peaceful green zones across most of Triangulum space. 5 years ago, you gave humans the freedom to enter any conflict zone in the galaxy. You said it was because we could survive where others could not. But that was never the real reason. The delegates listened in complete silence. You gave us that freedom because you knew we would use it responsibly. because you knew we would choose to help others, even when it cost us everything. Because you knew that humans don't just survive in conflict zones. We choose to care about what happens there. She looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes and sensors as she could. We accept the burden of being the species others call when everything else has failed. We accept the responsibility of making impossible choices in impossible situations. We accept the cost of caring when caring is dangerous. Boram paused, thinking about all the humans who would never come home, all the families who had lost loved ones, all the soldiers and negotiators and medics who had given their lives for strangers they would never meet. But understand this, she continued. We don't do it because we're better than you. We do it because someone has to. And in a galaxy full of species that are perfect at one thing each, sometimes you need a species that's imperfect at everything, but willing to try anyway. The chamber remained silent for a long moment.